on this chapter of Mythos and Logos, because Philosopher Kenneth Smith is sort of topsy-turvy, upending most of our basic assumptions about true and false, and how the mind works and how culture works and everything else inherently in this one chapter. This is the first of two chapters where he really goes into detail about what does he mean by myth. And when he talks about what he means by myth, he also means what did Nietzsche mean by myth? What would Kierkegaard or Hegel have meant by it? And particularly, what did the ancients mean by it? And in so doing, it's putting us into a perspective on true and false and information and subjectivity and objectivity and the mind and the world that is quite alien to the modern perspective. And the argument that's being made is that moderns have missed something fundamental. And that fundamental thing they missed is why we have holocausts and world wars and all kinds of other things. Why we have soulless systems that, grind people underfoot and don't care. It's all related to mythos versus logos and the nature of the mind and the nature of culture and so forth. So it's challenging. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye. When we talked about the myth of Sharon a moment ago, for example, the myth of Sharon, when it was, but a myth is what's not true, would be the logos perspective. The logos cultures, Apollonian cultures like our culture, say a myth is something false. A myth is a false story. But the Greeks didn't believe that. To the Greeks, myth was the very heart of their culture, and it was a completely different thing to them than it is to us. And so if a Greek was talking about the myth of Sharon, it would be a profound, deeply true story that is a generator of meaning and virtue and behavior. It organizes our whole worldview for us in a way that's
I can buy
sustainable. Right? I mean, the myth of Sharon, it might be that we just can't have functional, human, healthy cultures without the myth of Sharon, depending on what's in that myth. If it were a myth in the Greek sense, if it's a myth in the modern sense, the myth of Sharon is a false story that isn't true, and we want to know about what's actually true. And so there's this direction, right? We have to be amphibious about this. We have to be able to think in multiple perspectives and compare them to each other, and that's what this chapter is going to do, right? Myth, soul, earth.
So the myth, idea of a myth, a true myth would include the Apollonian, and or the Apollonian only plays a minor part in a myth.
So in the classical ancient sense, the Apollonian and Dionysian both have to contribute to myth. They have to be in service to something important, right? So it's not just what the way to answer the question is with the missing third piece, right? We talk about the dualic or Dionysian. We talk about the fertile, unconscious, emotional, driven, natural, fated, suffering aspects of life in which we are immersed in something greater than ourselves and aren't in control and don't always know everything. And then there's sort of the Banausic, Apollonian, rationalist, logical, systematic, organized, we will be the deciders, nobody's in charge of us approach, the great world machine of modernism. And that's another mentality. And we've talked before about how people tend to slide to one side or the other and see that one is the answer, and that's what they should be, and that's what they should do, and it feels right to them. And they eschew the other as anathema. But we also talked about the way that each one of them is a cyclopean perspective with one eye, half-witted. It's not engaging the full human faculties for thought and perception. And as a result, neither of them is self-explanatory in terms of itself, although they both claim to be. So a true myth, in the classical sense, has to pull them back together and create a weave, right? So that the logic of the world and the laws that we create and the ways that we think about things and the way we organize our information are in service to the things that we need to survive and be healthy and sustainable as a species, as part of the greater nature. And so the Dionysian and the Apollonian get woven together in the classical sense of myth in a way that they aren't if we just ask a doulos or a Banausos what they think myth is. I know it's a long answer to a short, direct, simple question, but
yeah, that's an interesting way of seeing that correspondence between the dualic with the not Dionysian, and then the other one with the Apollonian.
The
So it's a kind of a
Benasis.
social construct. He's saying that there's this social construction, understanding society in terms of these primal forces, right?
Yeah, yeah. When we look at the world through one or the other of these lenses that we're born with, um, it changes everything about how the world looks. And in turn, that changes everything about what seems to be meaningful and seems to be important and seems like good or evil. Like literally the entire template of culture is laid out in front of you based on, which of these two kind of half perspectives you slide into. And so this is one of the ways in which what Kenneth Smith does with his philosophy goes way beyond what I've been stressing in the last couple of months. I've been stressing the need to be polyperspectival, right? To be able to shift between perspectives. And that's essential. But he further argues, along with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Hegel and the Greeks, that when you start adopting a polyperspectival view of the world and you start to be able to think in multiple modes, what you discover is that there aren't an infinite number of completely different cultures, and there aren't an infinite number of completely different mindsets. We're not all pretty snowflakes who are all unique. What happens is that although there are variations and we are all unique technically, that uniqueness is framed within a small number of possible frames, right?
Well, I would disagree with that. I would think that not that there's an infinite number of things, but there's an incredible multitude of possibilities that are determined, by whatever one's cultural family, whatever one's experiences are. And that to me, myth is not the thing, but it's the engagement. So myth includes the self as a process that one's in, allowing like multiple things just like to appear, to kind of guide oneself. And I would even put memory as a mythic form, that when a memory pops in your head, it's like a myth. It's pulling you somewhere, and to kind of let it be, and kind of like the Apollonian kind of thing is sort of like the stepping back from a bit and looking what it is, sort of like in an artistic kind of way. You put the colors down and stuff, and it's spinning and stuff, and you're in the experience. And then there's a breath where you're kind of looking what's there. To me, that's kind of like the Apollonian thing, is kind of like looking at the structure and stuff like that, but doing it almost like in the sequence of breathing, that quick, boom, and then back in to let the flow of the multitude of potentials to kind of flow through, because I think that, from my reading of it, it seems so heavy in Deleuze, which I can't believe, he doesn't mention. It just seems totally there.
What was the word you said?
Deleuze, the philosopher.
Can you put that in the chat?
Yeah, that's the French philosopher who has this kind of like a tripartite notion of the soul too. Like instead of the Plato's chariot,
Right.
He has this three synthesis. The beginning synthesis is habit, memory, and then the third synthesis is where you have this more enlightened understanding of a self as being in rhythm with the infinite, with ion, with a different level.
Yeah.
As opposed to chronos. Chronos is the time that we usually live in the world of habit and memory. But in ion, it's the understanding, the comprehensive understanding. Sort of like Hegel's synthesis, I guess. I
was going to say it's got analogies here to the Hegelian and the Greek perspective. Yeah. I'd thanks for that. I'd say, Patrick, that you and I are agreeing just from different perspectives on the same issue, because what they're trying to get at here is this idea that when you talked about the structure of memory and memory being like a myth, that's the thing that Apollonianism doesn't want to be true. Apollonianism wants the mind and memory to be like a computer, and we store facts, and the facts are stored with greater or lesser fidelity, but they're facts, and that we retrieve them so that we can compute with them. It has this very systematic, logicalist view of how the human mind works. And the one thing that AI teaches us about the human mind is it's nothing like a computer. The Apollonian model actually doesn't match at all. And instead, when we remember things, it's like you're saying, Patrick, it's more like a performance of a story. Like we're re-immersing ourselves into this unconscious recreation of what feels now like it was the case then. And so as we change over time, what we recreate may be different than what we recreated right after it happened. Melinda.
This is my first time with this group, but this
Hi.
is fascinating. Hi. So I'm an artist and a theater artist. And so I'm resonating quite a bit with one of the axioms of theater is the world of today, the world of the character, and the world of the playwright.
Yeah.
So in a way, that tripartite approach also incorporates the current ethos under which we have been formed and grown up, and what was Shakespeare experiencing?
Right.
What did the words mean to him? And then the world of the actual characters who could be, Timon of Athens, or so I'm fascinated by this three-part. I've always argued in theater that the story has deeper truths. The myth has truths, and all of my independent study, as non-academic as it has been on myth, on the truth of myths, and how is it that myths engage us to experience a level of understanding. And I actually wrote my thesis on comparing comedy to DNA helix, that there's the double strands, and then there's the cross piece that connects the strands of the past and the intellectual Apollonian understanding, and then the actual way in which we act and engage the world, and the world is engaged to us. So this is fascinating to hear this from just a philosophical, didn't mean to demean that, a philosophical lens, because I've always done it in an actually application of how this works on audiences.
Yes.
And so the psychological and emotional connection fascinates me. So thanks for bringing this up. This is already in the first 10 minutes and you got me. Good for you.
Oh, go ahead, Sharon.
Well, the second paragraph of this essay, the last sentence, where I think he effectively defined myth, and this helps me for the whole essay, where he says the mythic mind, may I read it, to see beyond accepted convention. To see and think in an original way is to see the world as the mythic mind saw it. And a world in which myths are not made, but given as, and this is the part that really got me, the natural effluent of reality, copulating human intelligence. And I thought that verb was just interesting. The use of that verb was just really interesting. So
yes.
It's reality melding with the human mind.
Yes. Yeah, this is all over it. I mean, this is, part of what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and the other young Hegelians were doing in response to Hegel was they were trying to get more juice into him. They were going back to the same source, the ancient Greeks, but they were trying to get more of the Dionysian, theatrical, story-based, mythic-based, emotionally-based side of philosophy into what Hegel said. It's all in Hegel, but Hegel expresses it all extremely rationally and intellectually as a huge system, which makes it hard to get at what he's really trying to say. But you start to read Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and you see that they've brought in all this poetry and all of this. Nietzsche got started with music. He was writing about Wagner, for example. How does it make you feel? Why does it have this effect on you? What is it arousing in you? And when the Greeks invented formal classical tragedy, during the Dark Age and brought it in with the coming of the Homeric epics. It was as part of a culture project to reshape Greek culture to be less self-destructive and to try to push it more towards competition instead of conflict in terms of the potential for cooperation. But the only way they knew how to do that was with stories, with myth, because they said the problem is once your frame is set, it's very hard to dislodge you from your fundamental premises. And of course, this is the flaw in all logical systems. What is assumed before you begin thinking? What's the a priori? What are your propositions that you start out with? That's where the blind spots are in logical systems. And that formatting in human beings takes place before we start thinking critically, when we're very young, when we're still, you know, an immediate, as he said in the first chapter of this, we're still in an immediate live wire directly experiencing life the way an infant does. You know, everything is surprising, everything is engaging, everything is new. You know, that flaw that Hegel warns us about, that the familiar, just because it's familiar, is not recognized for what it is missing in an infant. Nothing's familiar. It's all like, holy crap, what is that? Is that my finger? Oh my God, I've got one on the other side too. Whoa! You know, it's like they're able to ask questions and engage with reality at a level of not taking things for granted that it's just not possible for an adult. And so that's when the shaping happens, right? The ground stuff of the mind, the deep preconscious, subconscious framing that then we're stuck with for the rest of our life. And thereafter, if we're trying to escape our framing, we have to do so in weird roundabout ways, getting leverage against ourselves because there's so much strength in the framing. So what the Greeks saw is you've got to get that frame set right from the outset. That's why they were so interested in paideia and anthropoculture. That's why Aristotle says, or, you know, words to the effect that, you know, all who've observed the fate of empires, you know, understand that everything depends upon the education of the children. Paideia and is where the basic success or failure of anthropoculture gets set in motion.
You know, I would disagree with you that it's not accessible. You know, I think that, you know, even like the pre-Socratic Greeks, you know, they're about, you know, the emphasis is about becoming rather than a being, you know, and so that's like kind of the mythic push, is to kind of, you know, re-engage that we are becoming, even though we think we're not becoming because we're buying stories and the acculturation says that we're static, we're the same. That's not the truth. We're always becoming. You know, we might become by kind of repeating the same exact thing because we kind of, you know, don't have methodologies to engage other, you know, realities that are always kind of present with us.
I agree with you. I agree with your disagreement with me. I didn't express it as deeply as I should have. You know, Heraclitus is right on the nose that like a river, we're flowing, we're becoming, we're constantly changing. But at the same time that that's true, what's also true is that we're not becoming randomly. What's happening is that the Greeks used to overly turn this into one of those little gnomic nuggets we have to really unpack to get the meaning out of. But they used to say, we only become what we already are. And they didn't mean we don't change. They meant that the opposite of what it sounds like in English. They meant that we contain that we're not just a being who exists, we're also a seed full of all this potential that we're not aware of. And that over the course of our life, all that logic and teleology that's already inside of us is going to unfold and unfold and unfold and change us over time. And it's going to unfold in a way that responds to the world around it. You know, Sharon talked about nature copulating with human intelligence. And that's this idea that the unfolding is not robotic and mechanical. It's not just fixed programming that's being deployed in phases, but rather at every stage of a new unfolding of order from the seeds that are already within us, the unfolding is completely shaped by our circumstances and what we experience in the world around us. And so as a result, to the Greeks, teleology wasn't just a simple arrow that points to a specific destination. It was a set of forces put into motion that through their interaction with the forces of the world around us, that's what determined the direction of the arrows. And that's why a human being couldn't see in advance where he was going to end up, because it was constantly bouncing around through all of this shaping.
Yeah. So yeah, we're definitely shaped by our culture and traditions within our culture, and that I think people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, particularly, right, was trying to explore what is our being, our true being, um, in this world of becoming, but we're also shaped by that culture in that world. And so if you're, totally dogmatically set about who you are within that culture, then you're just a product of that culture that does, that you have a sense of yourself that is not changing. And so, like Nietzsche and Heidegger, these people are talking about the world of becoming, going back to Heraclitus and saying we're always, becoming, changing, and so forth. But what is our true sense of self, right? In that process of becoming.
Yeah. I see Dave's got his hand up. Go ahead, Dave.
Hey, I just wanted to say that I really appreciated his exploration of the dichotomy between myth and science and rationality, and really maybe trying to elevate the importance of myth as a unifying force in our culture and reveal some of the shortcomings of a more materialistic, scientific, rational uh, viewpoint. But I just wanted to read a quote from famous quantum physicist
Please.
Werner Heisenberg. And
Yes.
I just wonder if, and I know that Ken Smith was writing this in '97, so maybe some of these concepts weren't quite as popular, but I think in this quote, he seems to unify the world of myth and science. And I'd be so curious to hear how Ken Smith would respond. But Heisenberg says, the first gulp from the glass of modern sciences will turn you into an atheist. But at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting for you. And in this, he seems to sort of explore this concept of natural sciences only going so far. And once you get to the bottom of the cup, you really do have to take a leap of faith into sort of a mythical reality to make any sense of this quantum, mechanical, physical world that we all live in. It's interesting to me, it unifies myth and science because this world of quantum mechanics, it's almost become a myth in and of itself. The idea that a particle could be in two places at once simultaneously, the idea of non-locality. These are sort of mythical concepts being explored in a heavily scientific and rational way. So I wonder if there could be some unification here between these two opposites through this vehicle of quantum physics. It's just something that occurred to me, and I would be so fascinated to hear how Ken Smith would respond to that. But just wanted to throw it out to the group.
Sure. Yeah, the god of the gaps is the shorthand for the things that science can't explain. That's where we put God. And then the problem is that was great in the 17th century when there was all kinds of stuff in our everyday life that we couldn't explain. But the more we push out to the frontiers of knowledge, the more we sort of explain everyday life, the more it seems to make God diminish. And this was part of Nietzsche's criticism of the way that we had structured the purpose of God was in such a way that God seemed to evaporate over time, and we gave less and less focus. But there's another way to reconcile them other than God of the gaps, and that's what he's really trying to get at here. You're right that the Heisenberg quote is sort of echoing throughout this, but not directly in the way Heisenberg meant it. Rather, in the deeper thing Heisenberg meant, that if we take the premises of science literally as they are, we end up with a body of knowledge that doesn't tell us what to do with it. We get to know all kinds of things and be able to do all kinds of things, and yet not be able to decide between right and wrong, because right and wrong, ethics, virtue, values, this is all the stuff that's sort of left out. And that's because of the deal that science had to make in the 14th and 15th century. Please don't burn me at the stake. I'll let you, religion, tell me what's right and wrong. I'll just tell you how to be effective. I'll just give you tools to lob missiles and build ships and so forth. That diremption that happened created what we call science today is almost half science. It's like it's completely evacuated. It's got a medieval church-shaped hole in it. And there's things it won't go into. Or if it goes into, it goes in very tentatively for because it's centuries long habit now that you just don't get into that stuff. But what the Greeks thought is that stuff that it's not getting into is the very most important stuff to get into. Nothing's more important than helping to shape people in terms of right and wrong. You don't want to raise a generation of Hitlers and hand them nuclear weapons, let alone aqueducts and how to build better cars, or all that technology and power. We just sort of hand it out there devoid of any value judgments, devoid of any kind of a idea for what is the right and wrong way to use this and why in terms of the world around us. You'll see Kenneth go at science a lot in these essays. And it's not because he doesn't like science. He reads voraciously. It's because we have a half science that steers clear of the very most important topics, which are, should we be putting the greediest of us in charge? Should we, why are there so many psychopaths among CEOs? Should that be a concern? Should we be handing corporate organizational power to people who don't actually care whether other people live or die? And, science's position is we pass no judgment on this. That's not our business.
I think that's a great, very astute comment. And I think it echoes some of what Ken said in this particular essay about having no ego. And I was just thinking that, he says modern culture is psychopathic. I thought, modern myth is very egocentric. And the idea of getting away from the ego, is it even possible if we're being imprinted with such, and think about kids growing up today, YouTube, Instagram, all of this stuff seems to reinforce the ego precisely at the time when we need to let it go, to be able to thrive together as a species on a planet with finite resources. So it's just interesting.
Yeah,
I think it's also that the ego, there's a pathological element to it. The ego itself is sick. Not that the ego is bad, but it has a sickness, and it's almost like the Heidegger thing, when you're talking about science, it's like Heidegger says, the problem of the age is that we're all trapped in this technical kind of thing where it's all quantity and machines and we're measuring. And even when you used all your phrases, oh, should we be doing this? Should we be doing that? The inference, the culture says, oh, let's decide that by looking at the technical statistics of what it is, rather than kind of like, getting in touch with a deeper reality of where else we could be going, so the science could be going in a very different direction than it is. The ego could be going in a very different direction than it is. It's kind of trapped in its own kind of past and acculturation. It doesn't see because it's so far down the path.
Yes. Hannah put a great quote in the chat right out of this. Science is, of course, the same culture to extinguish all cultures hitherto, just as capital is the form of property deterministically bent on obliterating all other forms of property. There is this mechanical working out of the logic of the system that we're encouraged not to think about. We just focus on what it takes to, pay our bills and do our job day to day, and we're kept busy with that. It fills up our time to keep us from ever sitting back and going, is this a good direction? And if it's not a good direction, and I'm not, a billionaire, and I'm not the head of a, world-straddling corporation, how can I make an impact to try to make it clear to people that it's not a healthy direction and we should go somewhere else? And what we find when we look at that is that the system has been carefully constructed as a labyrinth, or rather not by design, but it has converged upon this structure of a labyrinth that disempowers anybody who doesn't have money. So that's almost everybody in a system where there's a increasing polarization in wealth.
And I think that going right along with that is the artistic spirit, because the artistic spirit is meant to engage the emotions and to engage the quote soul, engage the interior struggle of these ethical concepts. And I think we see that clearly in the capitalization of art, that and the diminishment of art as an important function of culture and life, and only valued for its capitalistic abilities. Whereas I think that the role of arts, that we've really gone way far off the fulcrum here. The role of arts is to get us to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes.
To feel, to be in a setting, and you have to set that setting up in an experiential way, I believe, because art is experienced in the question. Art, and it's not an intellectual question, it's a heart question.
Right.
Just to use that metaphor, it's an interior question of what's the word I'm searching for? The not knowingness, the beauty, the delight, the excitement, and the utter sadness of not knowing.
Yeah.
And we don't sit in that moment. We don't sit there very long, and our arts get shorter and shorter. And novels are based on how many pages and how many words, and cutting out pieces of punctuation, not because they're not needed, but because they take up space on a page. And if you cut out a bunch of semicolons and colons and commas and double spaces after sentences, it's these minute acceptances of changes in the way we experience that I think is part of this discussion of the valorizing of capital, and the valorizing of control features. We don't like to be out of control. And being out of control is one of the most interesting places.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would call it becoming. It's becoming. That's what it is. It isn't necessary. It is out of control because it's leaving the control, but it's becoming, and if art actually, had a groundswell and became a more kind of popular, movement and stuff like that, it would be attacked. There would be, things that attacked keeping that. And perhaps, the capitalization of art is the thing that keeps it down, keeps it from becoming that.
Absolutely.
And that's a force that's against it. But the art is there, and it's like, oh, I need to make money. Hold it, I want to make money in the capitalization of it. But it's the thing that's actually keeping it from being what it is. It's distorting it. It's perverting it.
Because there's such a low level of patronage, because it's not valued.
I'd like to offer a comment and a question.
Please.
Melinda, that's a wonderful thought you're giving me. And I was reminded so much of Simone de Beauvoir's book on the ethics of ambiguity. And she spoke very much that ambiguity can be thought of as perhaps the ground of philosophy, is that to be ambiguity is one of philosophy and humans' greatest challenge, is how do we deal with ambiguity in life and in situation. So I thought what I heard from you, just she says in the opening chapters, she speaks to what you were getting at. The question I have is it possible that Camus acknowledged and gave acknowledged to the concept of myth when he wrote the Myth of Sisyphus and used it as a platform for his existentialist project? So I mean, that's my question.
So I think Camus, that the Sisyphus thing, in a way, came up with a very back into the world view. You're just, almost like a Buddhist, a problem with a Buddhist kind of thing is that, just be in whatever it is, don't, that, rolling that rock up the hill is good. And there's something deep to find out in that. But there's also, that's true, but there's also something else that, is going on there, which is like the psychological element. So like people are trapped in a non-mythical kind of reality because there's something that's keeping them there that they don't want to think about. It's not just that they're being trapped by the culture. You know, there's something going on that keeps them from those directions. You know, it isn't just the outside culture. There is some kind of ingrained thing that they accept and that they're afraid of, and that's like a huge element of this. And it shouldn't just be about acculturation. It's also about like how, you know, the form, their being, you know, their sameness. They're insisting on an identity that's stable rather than an identity that becomes over and over again.
Yeah, he's probably, Camus is actually talking about, the absurdity of so many of the things that we do in modern life, maybe, not just at that metaphysical level, but, for instance, how we, treat nature, at the same time, we are part of nature, we are nature itself, but we don't, think of ourselves as being part of nature because we are thinking in Apollonian terms, that
Right.
we are in control, we are dominating nature. We just extract whatever we need from it, and we don't think of ourselves as part of that, cosmos of natural things, and so we're actually destroying ourselves. It's just the absurdity of that, is, I think the artist sometimes, points out the paradox, the contradictions in how we, live. We're just read this article about Spinoza, and he was able to, see that our relationship with nature, and he uses nature, and he uses the term God also to represent, for nature. And so we're made of, everything we are is made of this, it's composed of the same substance as what we think, as what nature is, so that kind of.
May I make a footnote about ambiguity and the God of the gap?
Go ahead, Veronica.
But it's psychology. That's okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
So there is something called equilibrium in the brain, and that means that the chemistry between the two hemispheres of the brain like to be equal. And it's called equilibrium. When it's not equal, we feel anxiety. And when we don't know something, when we don't understand something without explaining what's going in the brain, that causes lack of equilibrium. And we try to achieve equilibrium from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, and possibly also when we are asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ambiguity is the lack of equilibrium. The God of the gap give answers in order to create equilibrium. We achieve equilibrium by giving answers to ourselves. And if we don't know the right answer, we'll give ourselves the wrong answer because that will take us out of our anxiety.
Perhaps.
Once we discover that something works in that respect, we keep it. And this is our belief system. And
I was
does it make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I was actually going to build on that.
The God of the gap, the ambiguity, and
yes,
that there is
thank you.
something inside rather than outside.
It's a great contribution, Veronica. Thank you.
I thought that was a great point, and I just wanted to briefly add that maybe that's why there's so much generalized anxiety today anyway, is that we're out of equilibrium between myth and science. And if we can
Correct.
somehow bring these back into equilibrium, maybe devaluing science slightly and appreciating the importance of myth, then that overall level of anxiety could be reduced. Just something that I thought of when you mentioned that, Veronica. Thank you.
I think also, that anxiety, like Heidegger and Sartre, push that anxiety is conscience calling you toward something deeper. So you're using the word anxiety could also just be a cultural overlay that keeps us trapped, that's something we want to avoid. But that might not be what we want to avoid. That's calling us to the point for us to engage with, not to get rid of it, but that there's something there. It's something of growth. It's something of newness and stuff. I just want to put that out as an opposite.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Go ahead, Sharon.
The function of myth in a culture, I think, is to add equilibrium to the culture. And I think the anxiety comes when the myth is out of sync with the reality. And I think that's where we are now.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say that in philosophical terms. But.
Yeah, I want to explore that in a moment in some depth. And Melinda, we can call on you too. But I see Richard's had his hand up for about 15 minutes. So go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. I had a bunch of responses, but like it's been, the kind of conversation has kind of gone on a bit. But I guess like to the current threads. So I think more generally, a lot of the anxiety we're feeling in society, a lot of thinkers have brought up something that was studied by French sociologist Émile Durkheim as the concept of anomie. I think did I bring this up? We probably may discuss this in a previous session here. I think. Maybe or no, can't remember. But anomie is like the social condition that occurs when a society's previous common norms and values disappear and disintegrate, and then but you're in this intermediate stage when you're not sure what the new norms and values are going to be, and it causes people to feel a lack of belonging and disconnection and alienation. Like Émile Durkheim studied this like within the context of actually trying to understand suicide actually, and kind of found this to be a kind of common thread. And I think this can speak to, like the role of technology and the way our science, causes to, feel disconnection. Sort of just as a random kind of thing back on the discussion of art. I guess I know enough, just enough like finance and economics stuff to be dangerous. But I guess I didn't quite understand the use of the term capitalization, or I think it's maybe being misused here, unless it can be, I can be corrected. But I think more precisely, I would think of it as actually it's a commodification of art, within our society, as opposed to capitalization. But I think that's.
Yeah, and just very quickly, Richard, to your point, that's my understanding that the Frankfurt School, particularly Walter Benjamin, wrote on that topic quite a bit. That art had that risk of banality and capitalization and monetization as compared to original, unique art. So there was a tension that they spoke of, which speaks to your point. A good one. Thank you.
Yes. Melinda, were you earlier trying to make a comment? Okay. So there's some interesting stuff here. One of the building off of this anomie idea, one of the premises that Kenneth Smith and others work with on this is that myths are value-laden. It's not enough to be a story. It has to be value-laden. It has to be creating a view of the world that illustrates and, more importantly, kind of pushes us emotionally around certain values. And a good example of that is the myth of Oedipus. You'll see Kenneth Smith talk about Oedipus almost every essay he writes. He does it all the time. And he says Oedipus is the classic example of a myth that moderns absolutely fail to understand. So we interpret it as just a story, and we interpret it as false. So what we can take away from that as moderns is we assume there never was a guy named Oedipus, probably. And even if there was, he doesn't really matter. The important thing is that this is a story to pass the time. Maybe somebody told this story to get money. Maybe they told this story so people would admire them as a storyteller. Maybe, they may wanted to make money. We make a list and they're all modern reasons. And we're left with a complete inability to understand why the story of Oedipus, why the tragedies, for example, were composed by Sophocles. The Olympics weren't just for physical competition. They were also for competition of composition. People brought songs and plays to the Olympics and to the other three annual games. And Sophocles won competitions with Oedipus Rex. Actually, it wasn't Oedipus Rex. It was Oedipus Tyrannus, the tyrant Oedipus, not King Oedipus, the tyrant Oedipus. And that's, of course, we if you look on Wikipedia, you'll see they might mention that, oh, by the way, it's also actually technically called Oedipus Tyrannus, but then they go on to call it Oedipus the King, as though that's not actually an important distinction. And if you've read Aristotle's essay on the Athenian constitution and the forms of government, you'll understand it to the Greeks. The difference between a tyrant and a king is incredibly important as part of the whole point of the play, which is lost on us, right? Because we can't imagine there's anything important going on in the structure of what Sophocles wrote. We figure it was just for a modernist kind of reason that he must have written it, but that's not it at all. What he's trying to show us is, and he didn't know at the time that he was trying to show this because we didn't exist yet as a culture, he's showing what happens if a modernist is in charge. The problem with Oedipus is he wants to deal with everything like facts and clues and information, and he doesn't want to deal with the fundamental principles and values that are underneath everything. So it's not a story about a guy who slept with his mom and killed his dad. That's not the point. The point is it's a story about a guy who has no interest in his past. He has no interest in the roots of things, in archive, in where things come from, in how they came to be the way they are now, and what ought to happen. So as king, he treats everything that's happening as something current. He's living in an eternal present. He's looking for a malefactor right now. And he's unable to think back that maybe things in the past have set all this in motion. Things went wrong a long time ago. And that the miasma over Thebes reflects that and not something that's currently happening. He thinks like the classic modernist hero who doesn't have any preparation, didn't spend his life trying to cultivate virtue, trying to be excellent at what he did. He's just trying to be clever. He's trying to clever his way through all the mysteries that surround him. And what he discovers is, as he tries to use his intelligence in a raw, immediate, modernist Apollonian mode, it leads him into the darkest, worst places. He discovers that, see, he spent his whole life that way. Who's this asshole at the river who won't make way for me, right? How does he end up picking a fight with his own dad? It's because he reduces what should be a complex social interaction to, you're in my way, get out of my way, right? Oh, you were rude to me, that made me angry. Everything in him is this immediate, present. And so he misses the significance of things. He's living a life of facts without meaning, without deeper archive, without deeper principles. And that's because he was raised outside of the culture of kingship. He was raised as a peasant boy. His specialty is, what he's suited to do because of the way he was raised is to herd sheep. He would probably be outstanding at that. But if he wanted to do something else, he'd have to train himself to become a different person than he is right now. He's optimized for the wrong thing. So that whole, question yourself, learn to question your motives, learn to look more deeply at things. That doesn't come naturally to people. You have to be trained into it, and he never was. So he's not fit to be king. So as a result, in making what seem like the right choices time after time, and more specifically, making the banausically correct choices where the facts all look right and they all point in this direction, he ends up instead causing the very worst possible things to happen to himself. The reason that he marries his mother is because to the Greeks, that was the worst possible thing they could imagine could happen to corrupt your relationship with your mother. And so they wanted to show how you could go through a process of making intelligent decisions based on the present, based on facts, and wind up in the worst possible situation. And that's why he kills his dad in this myth, because he's living in an eternal factual present, dealing only with evidence and details and technique, what the Greek called technai. Techniques, technology, how to do things, skills, but not archai, not values, not principles, not myths. He's coming in without all that stuff cold and just trying to think his way to success. And so his purpose in Greek mythology is not so we go, ew, he married his mom, ew, he poked out his eyes, which is how a modern reads it. The whole point of it is to show that the modernist worldview leads to crisis and chaos. It leads you to holocausts and world wars and eco crises. And the Greeks could see that coming. Like, you just
And
can't.
this is the hubris. This is the hubris that we
Yes.
overlook.
Yes.
It's not an individual story. It's
Yes.
a cultural story.
Yes.
It's a story where the present becomes the past, becomes the future, becomes the reason, or not reason, becomes the animating force.
Yes.
And which is why we still study them 6,000, 5,000, however many thousand they were.
Yeah.
Whenever Sophocles was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2,500 years.
Yes. And just as a sidelight, I'm actually writing a play novel right now, which is about myths. And so this is fascinating to me. Ground. And going off into these other inclusions, which is, I think, the whole point of what the Greek artistic spirit was about the inclusions coming into a fullness and coming into an inclusive whole, where contradicted is not an enemy. And I think that's one of the most important points of these philosophies and studying them, is that contradictions are not an enemy.
So is it ironic,
I would think
They're
too
a chance
or is it
for
ironic
us to go deep.
that Freud gave the name of his major complex, right, in our psychology, the Oedipus complex, right?
Yes.
Right, but if you took, like, instead the tyrant Oedipus, he's the tyrant because he solved the myth, the riddle of the Sphinx, which is the mystery. That's why he's the tyrant. He took away the mystery, the riddle, and said, "Oh, I solved it. I'm moving on." But that's the basis of that story. He's the tyrant because he solved the riddle, or thinks he solved it.
Yes. Yes. You know, this essay was written in preparation for Kenneth Smith writing Otherwise, which is all parables and paradigms and paradoxes. And he wanted to get real crisp about his understanding of mythos culture versus logos culture before he began trying to do things in a right brain kind of artistic way. So you know, it's telling that his metaphor in Otherwise for myth and mystery is the Sphinx. He comes back to the Sphinx 3 times in Otherwise, and he comes back to it one more time for every additional book of parables he did after that. So you're right on the nose here about the importance of the Sphinx, which we treat as just some sort of monster encounter that's part of the backstory, whatever. I mean, it's interesting, but then we move on and we think, oh my God, he slept with his mom. Again, we miss the connections. What is it about the past that set in motion the present? What unfolding in him began step by step from the things that happened before? And this idea that that's the role of myth, that the purpose of storytelling and the purpose of myth is to show us the things we desperately need to know, but that we're unlikely to encounter in our ordinary lives unless somebody draws our attention to it.
Mhm.
That was deliberate. That was what the Greeks were doing with their culture project. That's why they formed the Olympian religion and set in motion the Homeric epics and set in motion the Olympian and the other games, and also set in motion the competition to write tragedies, specifically tragedies, to try to illustrate the limits and liabilities of the way our minds work, right? It's always explained to us that a tragic flaw is an excess of a good quality, right? This is how it's taught to us in school. And technically that's right. But more importantly, it's a good quality taken out of context and made master instead of servant. So the Apollonian brain is a great servant. Ego is a great servant. It makes a terrible master. And that's why the Greeks wrote tragedies about it. What happens if you let the ego be master? What happens if Oedipus lets his, left brain intellectualizing, I live in the present, I only need to be clever, who cares about myths, mentality rule an entire city-state? Well, disaster. Disaster is what happens. That's why it's a tragedy. So, the Greeks would look at this, age that we live in, where we're generating stories like at a density never before in the history of humanity, right? I mean, all the films, all the TV shows, all the radio plays, all of the books, it just goes on and on. massive wealth of media generating stories. And yet, most of them aren't myths, because most of them aren't trying to, put us into context with the things we desperately need to know in order to be a sustainable, healthy species.
And it kind of feeds this cycle. Like I remember like a number of years ago, like a few years after kind of the explosion of mobile, where everyone kind of had the power of Google in their pocket, just kind of pull it up and be able to quote know some fact or know something like immediately, right? And so there was some, what you could think of as like a modern day philosopher, I think, as a way Kenneth Smith understands it, like, or a critic of technology, and kind of, which just says like right now everyone can, quote, know like all these things, but we're not making meaning of it. We're not understanding it. Like that's the hard part of it, and like kind of like be able to like, to kind of draw these connections like longitudinally, like over time, right? And like kind of understand where we're coming from and where we're going, right? Like that way of thinking, and like the skill and all the context it requires, like, yeah, it's been something that's been completely devalued, or just not even like, I think I would say even worse. It's like it's sort of become like not even like a way of thinking that people are aware of as an option, like in our modern society. If you think about like, just kind of these instant reactions and sound bites and kind of moments from like from cable news, and then like in social media, it's just like it's always in the instant, right? As we're discussing here, right? And like this is even before like we're not even like talking about like the intentional disinformation campaigns and like the algorithms which basically like reinforce those and like force us into these like little polarized bubbles. That's
Kenneth Smith explicitly makes that point, Richard. He says that there is no truth without context in the essay. So that exactly gets to what you're saying. And I also just wanted to say that maybe our inability to appreciate myth or art, I think we're sort of synonymizing them, is because of this commoditized mindset, because we've allowed the ego to become our master. And if it's not going to make money, then why would we present it, right? Everything has sort of become this commoditized form of storytelling. So, our modern mind, we're really looking for, hey, that was a really enjoyable movie and it was a great way to spend an hour, but no one's really talking about what did we learn about through this experience that we can pass on to further generations and help us grow together in culture. I just think it all ties together. But yeah, great point, Richard. No truth without context. That's something.
And Dave, kind of to build on the other side of what you've just said, and I wanted to remark earlier on this, is that in the Olympiad, yes, they gave awards for tragedies, and then they had bawdy comedies, and they had sex comedies,
yes,
and they walked around with phalluses, and they laughed at each other. And Dave, what is the thing right now that is monetized? It's comedy. I mean, Netflix is full of the worst comedies that you would ever want to attempt to watch. Worst by being not very thoughtful. But it's also full of really good comedies. And so the meaning of comedy, I think, is one of the things that that's another thing that's diminished in value, is that it's just a joke. Right. Whereas the Greeks knew, and the Egyptians knew, and the Mesopotamians knew that comedy was essential to this process. Not only do we have to be absolutely serious in our rigorousness of trying to figure out who we are, but then if we think we figured out who we are, we have to laugh at ourselves. Because did we really? Wait a minute, our pants fell down. There's realities of the world that make us trip over our untied shoelaces, whether those shoelaces are quantum theory or neoconservatives economics. So I think one of the things that we also defund is serious art, because we have a plethora of comedy right now, but it's not the comedy of the Greeks, because their comedies, Aristophanes, I mean, Aristophanes was one of the most political writers in the history of Western civilization.
Yeah, he took on Socrates.
Socrates, yeah. I mean, Aristophanes, funny guy, talked about war, talked about economics, talked about leadership and blowhards. Fascinating stuff. And then you get to a different tradition, like the Mahabharata, and a different tradition of an inclusive humanity that makes mistakes and insights in the same moment, with the same words or the same experience. And going back to what Veronica said about this equilibrium, this sense of you can't, if you want the full picture of humanness and existence, you can't preferentially treat one over the other because you prefer one. One makes you feel better. So there's an equilibrium inside the equilibrium, which I think is quite an interesting thing too. Yeah, so, Peter, very famously, a director named Peter Brooks did the whole Mahabharata in the what is the arena in, where was the arena, Rick, where they did all the plays? What was the name of that? Anyway, I forget that. Anyway, he did it on 4 successive nights of 4 to 6 hour plays, the entire Mahabharata, with an international cast that did not speak the same language in the play, which is fascinating. So to me, it's like it was his attempt to fill the empty space, which is his famous book, The Empty Space, Peter Brook, to fill the empty space with as many questions as possible and not so many answers.
Mm-hmm.
Because the act of the question was the biggest act.
Melinda?
Yeah.
Can I ask you to clarify your definition of neoconservative economics?
The Chicago School of Economics, where I'm not a very good economist. So, Richard, I don't think I can do any better.
You may be talking about neoliberals and Milton.
That's what I mean. Thank you so much. See how not very good at this I am? And that's the comedy of it. Because I'm trying to make a good point and I fucked it up, which is what we do.
The human condition, right?
Right. Which is what keeps our ego from overwhelming our sense of limit.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. That was excellent. That was excellent, Richard. Thank you. Now I'll shut up.
There's a line that says the answer is the death of the question.
Yes. Yes. That has come up in some of Kenneth Smith's writings, and he got it out of Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Hegel. They're all talking about that. That's what underlies the logic of Hegel's argument that when things become familiar to us, we stop asking the questions we ought to keep asking.
I love this idea about the deleterious effect of commodification of culture, because we all know that there's something wrong with it, but why? And I think Ken Smith connects that to the degradation of myth and the importance of that in our life. That's why we can't just put a dollar value on absolutely everything. And I also love comparing and contrasting art and science. You know, you can't measure art. There are no measurements. It's a completely subjective experience. And comparing that with science, which is supposedly completely objective, but we know that's just a superficial definition of science, is very, very interesting. I think Ken Smith does a great job with really revealing why commodifying culture is such a bad avenue for us to go down as a species.
And
mean,
Dave, I would just add to one thing. It's not only an individual experience, but it's a collaborative experience, and it's a communitarian experience, which is why there are audiences, which is why you don't have a play without an audience, because it's the rest of us. But everything you said, yes.
Though I would think, the term commodification, is something to be looked at. We can just say it as a pejorative kind of term or something like that. But there's a lot to be unpacked in commodification. What's so attractive? Why is it there? What's really going on? What's the attraction? What is it taking away from? Rather than kind of, doing what is it taking away from? It's like, what is it giving us? What's that about? Why are we so engaged in that thing? There's, that something is trapped within there that's actually a value. I don't know what it is exactly, other than like a passion kind of, erotic kind of element perhaps, but, it's important to kind of not, set up reactive things like this against that, because like with art, art is a creative thought, and with Nietzsche, it's like there's an active thing, and then there's a reactive thing, so art is an active thing, but so it's important to kind of go in there in an active kind of way and to play with it, that there's something, whoa, what is this thing? There's something really interesting in there, rather than kind of being in the pejorative reactive way, because I think that's what happens a lot in culture, and why it kind of stays that way is we just stay in reactive patterns. This against that, that's bad, this is good. And, and it's not going anywhere, it's just staying in something that's a reactive way of being, which is accepting the sameness and not questioning the moreness, that there's something else, there's a mystery, there's a riddle to it.
I feel as though it's almost been forced on us, the commodification of culture. And if you look at all of our new myths, or I would just say entertainment has sort of taken the place of myth.
Yes.
That's all that it celebrates. I mean, that's it. That is what it celebrates. And we see that from cradle to grave. And so it is interesting to unpack that. I think it's forced on us by the, because so much power is concentrated in so few hands. I mean, if you own Netflix, you can create culture, right? So we have this ability now, which maybe didn't exist in the past, that a few people who benefit enormously from this commodification, despite the fact that the 99% of us are made worse off from it, can continue to force that narrative on us and thrust us into that value, their value system. And it's difficult to find an escape, because how are you going to eat? How are you going to pay your rent? How are you going to, do anything in the modern world without money?
Yeah, that's the proposition that the modernist order has put us into. We're basically held hostage. We either produce cash or we become impoverished. And as we know, especially in the United States, but also in some other countries, if you're poor, you can just subtract a certain number of years off your lifespan and a greater number of years off your health span. It's a money or your life. That's the proposition. And it's hard for that not to be convincing, right? So we turn away from what matters for the sustainability of the species and the ecosystems around us, and we focus instead on what we need to be able to pay next week's bills. And the theory of capital is that it's supposed to be a perfect representation of what actually matters, real values. That somehow through the magic hand, the invisible hand, the marketplace, aligns what it pays for with what people actually need. But what we actually see in the history of the modern order is that's not the case at all. That first of all, the producers shape desires to an extent that Adam Smith suspected, but never could have imagined the extent to which we do it now. There's a feedback loop going on that allows it to warp itself further and further away from what's actually required. And then there's also this problem that there are a lot of ways to make money, private wealth, private returns, by destroying public infrastructure. It's like, if there aren't any more forests and I own the last one, then you have to pay me through the nose for wood. And so there's an advantage to me to destroy the sustainability of the planet in order to hoard and then jack up prices, right? I can massively profit. There are a lot of perverse incentives like that sort of drill down into the system, and then they shape us because this is the system that determines our lifespan and our health span. So, but you see this with entertainment too, right? It's like if you were provided with a profound story that took a week to tell, but that helped to understand where we all fit into the world and how we ought to treat each other and all that, our need for additional stories, it wouldn't go away. But let's just say it would be cut back a bit, right? Because we could keep going back to this story that was so full of these revelations and implications of value and cosmic significance. But if our stories are all shallow and empty, then we pay for them. They entertain us for the 2 hours that we're in the movie theater and maybe for a dinner conversation afterwards, but then they're forgettable. And the next day we have the same problem we had the day before, which is what matters in this world? What should I be doing with my life? All this aching void inside of us that we evolved to have then re-empties through these sort of ersatz myths, these kind of cheap, disposable, fast food stories,
And like all of our stories from kind of entertainment from kind of like the Greek plays, that's on one end of the spectrum. And most of our entertainment now is spectacle. It's just pure spectacle, right? Kind of a little tidbit on the invisible hand. I haven't, read this firsthand, but like I've listened to a number of economists, who've studied this in more detail. And our whole kind of mantra and dogma on the invisible hand is something that's sort of like it's like a footnote that's taken way out of context and sort of expanded because ideologically it just fits our narrative, it
right.
fits our American, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and, divine manifest destiny, that type
yes.
of, So Adam Smith coined invisible hands only kind of relating to something kind of a specific situation within the Wealth of Nations.
Right.
Whereas like if you read his work more broadly, like Theory of Moral Sentiments and other works, like I don't think he intended that to kind of be this all-encompassing, like principle.
Right.
Same thing we did with Charles Darwin and taking him out of context with Survival of the Fittest, when in fact he mentioned love and cooperation, 100 times more. But that footnote is all history remembers because it serves our, I'll just throw it out there, don't crucify me for it, but it serves our commoditized interests. This serves the power interests that have grown up. And it also serves them that we have these disposable forms of entertainment because they have to keep pumping this out. They can't just put a story out and say, okay, we're finished now. They have to pay interest on debt. That requires constant growth, regardless of anything else. So to produce something that lasts is actually harmful to their interest. They want it to be as disposable as possible. They want you to get home and have that broken immediately so that you have to go out and buy another one, or you feel empty as soon as it ends and you press, you play for the next movie. They want that. They need that. And yes, this misreading of these historical characters, I think, fits into that as well.
It does. Sharon?
I have a question.
Please.
So the commodification of our culture turns us into consumers, right? And so therefore it takes away the values from us as citizens.
Yes.
Right? So so that's destroying the myth or enhancing the myth? I don't understand.
So let's talk about that, because that goes right to the heart of this thing. Part of what Kenneth Smith and the Greeks are arguing here is that we're in a difficult existential situation, our species as a whole. There are many species you can look at who are so bound up by their instincts in their behavior that no matter how much they think about what they want to do, no matter how much they feel about what they want to do, overall the numbers work out such that they end up in balance with the ecosystem around them. Evolution has sort of finished fitting them to their environment, and left to their own devices, things more or less work out. But that's not necessarily the case for every species, right? What about the predecessor species between them and the ones who were very different? You know, the process of evolution involves these transformations over time. So, you know, if you have one stable environment that you're well adapted to and the world changes and now you're in a disrupted environment, you know, the previous stable species isn't going to cut it anymore because those circumstances aren't there anymore. And so you have to go through a process of relatively rapid evolution. This is what Stephen Jay Gould talks about with punctuated equilibrium in evolution, that evolution is not steady, but it goes into these little bursts. And the reason for the bursts is there's times of change. And after the change, the previous circumstances don't work anymore. Your previous adaptations don't work, and you have to alter yourself. But the purpose of that change is not to be a species that is constantly changing and has no norm. The purpose is to evolve to a point that you now find an equilibrium with the new conditions, and then to stabilize within that environment so that you're highly successful within that environment. The period in between, which modernists idealize as the perfect condition for a species, is actually the worst condition for a species, because that's when a lot of what's in you is still adapted to circumstances that don't exist anymore. And part of it is only a rough draft for the new behaviors you need for the new circumstances in the world. You're an in-between species. You're a transitional species whose purpose is to teleologically, from a biological evolutionary standpoint, you know, although they argue relentlessly there's no purpose, but in terms of what actually makes species survive, your purpose is to finish and get to the other side and become a new species that's actually well suited for the circumstances. Now, we always assume that if you're massively flexible, you must be well suited to everything. But when we look at what we've done to the world, that doesn't appear to be the case. We actually have not, you know, made everything better. The jungles aren't richer. The soil isn't deeper. I mean, none of that stuff is true, right? Everywhere we've gone, things have gotten worse. We actually have the characteristics of a species that isn't finished. We have the characteristics of a transitional species, like, you know, somewhere in the past we had some ancestors who could stick around for millions of years and the environment would be fine, and maybe somewhere in our distant future we're going to have descendants who could stick around in the world and their descendants, you know, they'd be fine for millions of years, but not us, the way that we're behaving. Now, I bring this up even though it's using a modernist Darwinian framework, because the Greeks had a certain misanthropy that is much remarked upon about human nature and the human condition. Heraclitus talks relentlessly about our desires, the things that we want, are out of sync with our needs. There's something in us that's capable of craving and wanting and demanding things that are not good for us and completely neglecting the things that we need. And that's why he says it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they want. He says we are askew in our orientation from reality. So if somebody wants to make a lot of money off us, the best way to do that is to give us what we want, because we'll reward them for giving us what we want. But in the process of that feedback loop, we end up getting sicker and sicker because we're wanting something that isn't what we need. And meanwhile, we're neglecting some other thing that we do need, that you know, we either didn't pay attention to or are actively avoiding. But this is a pretty fundamental existential problem for a species to have.
Doesn't that perfectly describe the dopamine loops that technology has sort of put us into, and keep us coming back for more, even though it's harmful to us?
Get the likes, get the likes, get the likes. Yes, that's exactly what you're saying. You know, that phenomena, which we talk about as though it's some kind of a defect of modern social platforms, is actually not about them. It's about us, right? There were no high-tech social networks when Heraclitus was writing that there's something wrong with us because we want things that are bad for us. So the issue is, if we're going to survive as a species long enough to evolve into something more stable that actually wants what's good for it, you know, like cats want what's good for them, right? They're comparatively stable compared to us. Cattle, deer, there are a lot of species in this world that mostly want the things that they need, but we don't. We're a mixed bag. A lot of the things we want are very bad for us, and many of the things we need we don't want. So we're more of a transitional species. So how do we make ourselves a going, sustainable concern so that we don't destroy the world around us long enough to evolve into something that actually has healthy wants? And the Greeks said, that is the fundamental human problem. It's more important than anything else that we could be talking about or wasting our time on. Because if we don't solve that problem, all of our other problems flow from it right there. And that was what myths were for. It's almost the identifying characteristic of a myth is that it's pointing you either at something that you need that you should be pursuing or something that you want that you shouldn't want that's causing problems. They're trying to frame in the exact structure and nature of the human limits and liabilities that we all need to learn about and sort of work around. How do you make your ego be a servant, not a master? How do you make your desires be a servant, not a master? All of these fundamental problems, that's how you know it's a myth. If it's just, there's some bad guys and we killed them and we won and we get the girl and some money at the end, you know it's not a myth because it's that it's feeding the delusions that are causing us the problems. And so from that perspective, Kenneth Smith sometimes goes through and looks at popular culture and sort of does a little bit of sorting and sifting, trying to figure out who's really still today trying to tell you the stories about the things you need to know about yourself in order to be a going concern and how people can survive in the world, and who's not, who's just, and what you find is that the people who are telling the mythic stories aren't making any money because they're not feeding the things we want, right? They're feeding the things we need.
I think Kenneth Smith and probably yourself, like a lot of what you're just saying there, I think a foremost person to study in this area is René Girard. He talks about like ontological sickness and these stories that we tell, if we just kind of kill the bad guy and the good guys win, like that's what he kind of comes from the world of literary criticism originally, right? But he kind of coins these as like romantic stories, romantic novels, whereas the stories where we have like which the stories are described as novelistic, you end up with a novelistic revelation where at the end, like the person that you're in conflict with, you recognize yourself in the other and vice versa, and you can only kind of get that like through kind of like storytelling of a novel, which you're able to kind of go inside the brains and see this and kind of write about this. And sometimes this revelation occurs at the point of death, right, of the character. But kind of like speaking like to kind of your larger existential discussion of us as a species, are you familiar with the great filter theory?
Oh, tell me.
Okay, so there's something that astronomers call the Drake equation.
Oh yes.
Okay, which is how many galaxies and stuff. So the great filter theory is like, why haven't we found signs of of other intelligent life elsewhere? Because like from the Drake equation, there should be a lot of it out there. And the great filter is the idea that, prior to reaching that threshold where, you could detect, those other civilizations, or even like more impossibly, like, that those civilizations could travel, like how many light years to to contact other civilizations, like they, run into something, and that thing could be like, the environmental degradation, or like the complete stripping of resources of their planet, and so it's kind of, it's a little sad to read about, but it's interesting to I'll post a kind of a little article that kind of talks about that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. I have encountered that. I just forgot the name of it, but yes, that there's a bottleneck and that a lot of intelligent species don't get through it because there's so many ways to go wrong. This is what the Greeks didn't have exactly a theory of evolution, although when you look at all the metamorphoses going on in their myths, they certainly had an idea of changing and transformation. And they certainly had epochs of deities, who replaced one another over time. So there's like everything was there except the science. And you can, when you know to look for it, you can find it. Not in the Greeks who are writing the more pleasant things, but in the Greeks who are writing the more obnoxious, annoying things that we don't like to talk about today. So there was a myth that's not well known today about a king who wanted to get a true answer. And he knew you can't ask people because people are full of delusions. They will candidly tell, if they're not lying to you, their idea of honesty is to candidly tell you the false thing that they believe. So you can't trust people to tell you the truth. So the only way he could find out the truth was to get a god, but gods are too powerful. So what he had to find was a little god, because in the Greek myths there were layers of gods and levels of power. So he conceived the idea that he could capture a satyr. And a satyr may be a very low divinity indeed. I mean, really down there, but they're still a divinity, which means they have to tell the truth. They don't lie, because lying is beneath them. Lying is a mortal thing. It's disgusting. No God would put a lie in his mouth. That's something people do. Ew. So he went and captured a satyr. And actually, I think he captured Silenus, as I recall. Silenus. And I may be wrong about which one it is, but he captured some satyr. And he said, so now that I have you and you're in my power, because you're a small god and a weak god and I'm a strong king, I just enough to bind you. Now I can ask you my question and you'll have to tell me the truth. And he says, what's best for men? For human beings, what's best of all? Right? He wanted to know, what should we be doing? What should we be seeking? How do we get out of this trap of wanting the wrong things? What should we want? And this is where the misanthropy of the Greeks comes into play. And this is why this myth isn't popular. Because what this minor deity said is never to have been born, or failing that, to die swiftly. He says, to want the wrong things, to think the wrong things, to be completely dislocated from your place in the cosmos, to disbelieve in the things that matter, to believe in the things that don't matter, to be so completely confused is a hellish existence in which, half the problems in the world you create for yourself. And no other species has that problem. It's like, you're a mess. You're a mess, humanity. And so, the argument of philosophy was that we were trying to fix that problem by creating a prosthesis where all of those good desires and thoughts ought to be. The goal was that by creating culture deliberately, to engineer it to fill in that gap in us, we could train people to start to figure out what they need and teach themselves to want the things they need, and to be skeptical about the things we think, and to learn to use reality as a check on our ideas. We could leash our appetites and leash our ego, the twin problems of the Banausic mind and the dualic mind, to the things that matter, to reality, and to the things we need in order to sustain ourselves. That was the Greek philosophical project. It was that attempt at anthropoculture. And it was based on the idea that there's something seriously wrong with us. And it may not be nice and people don't want to hear it, and you can't make money by telling people this, but when you look at the behavior of people in the world, you can see that there is this enormous liability in us. There's these huge blind spots. It is so easy for us to be raised in horrible ways, self-destructive ways, destructive to others, and so on. Well, Hannah says it sounds like an Apollonian explanation. Normativity doesn't equal Apollonianism in this schema. In fact, Apollonian systems are often not normative at all. They often encourage you not to judge and not to think for yourself and to just follow along with whatever's happening. The Dionysian idea is more normative, because Dionysianism is based on the recognition that we aren't free-floating godlike egos making all the choices and taking actions ex nihilo. We are suffering beings like the animals are. We exist within a reality that, as Sharon said, it impregnates our minds. She was quoting the Kenneth Smith line. Reality copulates with our intelligence. We are penetrated by the cosmos, and we are shaped and molded by it, and we are not free thinking gods of reason or angels of reason. And so we need to know what reality is like, including our own limits and liabilities, and we need to orient ourselves to try to compensate for those things, because if we don't, the results are catastrophic. So that's the normativity, right? And the theory is, if you don't do that, you're going to end up with holocausts and genocide, slavery, world wars, all the things that we think of as the key identifiers of the modern era. It's like, this is the Oedipus world of what happens when you say, I shouldn't be bound by reality. I shouldn't be bound by normativity. I shouldn't have to learn all about the past and previous philosophers. I should be able to just make it up as I go along and try to outsmart reality. I should just think my way day to day like Oedipus. Well, then you end up marrying your mother and killing your dad and causing miasma for Thebes.
I would also point out, sort of going back to really good reads, I just got into Guy Debord, I think that's his name, the Society of the Spectacle. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and sort of touching on what Dave was talking about, how everything, because he was a Marxist sort of critic of Western civilization and Western society, and just like how everything has become commodities and everything has just become a form of entertainment, and it's this apparatus for which one can't escape. And it's really interesting trying to sort of decide whether it's forced upon us or if it's something that we willingly accept. Because the way that I see it is it's very comfortable to live like within the conveyor belts that culture has sort of put forth, and it's very scary to deviate from it or to try to step aside and sort of chart your own path or try to decide what's going on. And so it's really hard for, say, someone who's extremely non-conventional or to sort of not to say look at the people who do step outside and like shame them, because it's that Socratic idea, everyone's a fool but I'm the greater fool. So in a sense, like it I don't know, I wanted to point that out because it's really, I really enjoy him. I've only read a little bit of him, but I would absolutely recommend him. I would also say, I forget if it was here where I heard it, but sort of looking at humanity as this translational species, and it kind of, I think somebody had mentioned like artificial intelligence is the next stage of human evolution, and we're sort of at the end of like the human as an organism. And so it's really chaotic now because we're trying to quickly like put ourselves, or I don't know whether it's consciousness, I don't know, you can talk to transhumanists or accelerationists, but sort of put ourselves in these machines before everything just falls apart, because the machines are the only thing that can outlast whatever, or the wrath of our father nature, so to speak. But also too, like I find that to be a little optimistic. I'd feel pretty doomed if like humanity as we see it now is like the highest, the most extrapolated form of primate. That would be really unfortunate because we are quite confused as it is. So like there's optimism there, but I mainly wanted to throw out the Guy Debord reference. Great person, sad story though, but great person, great writer.
Yeah.
There was someone, I think it's Nietzsche, but I'm not sure, that says that the reason that we have all this technology and stuff, and that we're doing all these things, is because we're that deficient. The other animals aren't so fucked up as us. We need all this stuff to kind of prop ourselves up.
Yes.
And then another point, which I think is a Nietzsche thing too, he said that if truth was a woman, meaning rather than trying to get the truth and that we manipulate it, we're inside the truth. And and that to me is the art thing, is being inside of this thing that is greater than what we are.
Yeah, that we have to respect our greater context, because it was here before us, it'll be here after us. The ego can feel so infinitizing and expansionist that we can imagine living forever. People talk about teenagers, thinking they live forever, and part of what they're trying to get at is that stage of life when your ego begins to soar and you start to come into your sense of yourself as a person. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that we're still contingent. We're still dependent, and we're still penetrated by and immersed in and marinating in all of this other stuff from our culture and from the world around us. It's a dangerous delusion to think that we're seeing reality clearly and making our choices objectively, but it's also very hard not to slip into that. In fact, it's just sort of the natural working of our mind to just slip into assuming that what we see and what we think must really be so. And therefore, if we make a judgment on it and we decide to take an action, that must be a righteous action by definition, because we made it. It's like there's this low level error that we just sort of slide into when we're not thinking about it. So
this is what I think Kenneth Smith denigrates as like ahistorical. Right. Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead. Someone was just speaking up. Was that Sharon?
No.
Okay. All right. So the Greeks are arguing.
It was actually me. I hit the wrong mute button.
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
When you talked about objectivity and stuff like that,
yeah.
Like trying to figure it out, the ego and stuff, part of the problem is the culture, but the culture is very infused by the philosophy that, the Western philosophy, says this is what's reality, is to objectively. We're just this thing that we have the ability to be separate from it and look at the objects. where that, is not the truth at all. Whereas like, there are other thinkers in philosophy who didn't get, sucked in enough in the mainstream that are there that present other ways to engage in a more artistic kind of way.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff out there to find. There's stuff out there to learn. And one of the problems that we have in our modernist anti-culture is it's designed to drive all that stuff out and replace it with the, this movie will satisfy you for one day and tomorrow you have to buy another one. There's sort of this, the deep stuff gets in the way of kind of a river of profit. And so it gets marginalized. We get trained to want to smile, to want to be pleased. Kenneth Smith talks about placenta, and I put that up earlier in the chat. Placenta are things that please us, and they can please us emotionally or physically, but they can also please us intellectually. If they satisfy our ideologies and our programming, then they please us. And so we want to surround ourselves with, we want to purchase more of the things that tell us you're good, you're right, you see the world correctly, everything's fine, don't rock the boat, don't bite the hand that feeds you, don't ask difficult questions. There's sort of this, go ahead.
Though I think it's also, it isn't quite that. It's actually, it's like smoking a cigarette, I'll smoke the cigarette, and I'm doing that, and then I can get to start again. So it isn't necessarily the things that are pleasing and stuff. It's actually just a thing that enables us to repeat the same thing over and over again, and not be able to access the thing that, like Deleuze says, that there's difference, that identity comes from difference, and to access difference and to engage with it. So that the problem is more that we kind of, find ways to repeat the thing over and over again, like smoking a cigarette. I just have to get through this 5 minutes and then I can kind of start again. And that's the problem. It's not these little pleasures. The little pleasures are sort of like what the form is, but the problem is more that we're engaged in a thing to not be engaged in difference and allow it to kind of materialize.
Yes. Yes. You think about the way that idea of repetition leading to profit, the attempts to recreate the same experience the way that it was. It's the problem that Hollywood gets into when they want to make the sequel the same film as the previous film, only somehow different so that you'll go back and see it again, but not actually different because they still want the same number of people and the same amount of profit. And so there's this struggle that they're always in that gets talked about a lot in script writing circles, where sequelitis has this problem that the thing that the producers strongly suspect will be the most profitable, they also know won't work. So they're somehow trying to do it and not do it at the same time. It's like I light the next cigarette, and it's just like the first cigarette. And the thing that's interesting about cigarettes that you see pursued in Hollywood and in the market generally is that it's not a complete interaction, it's a dependent interaction. You have to smoke that next cigarette. You need it. And that's what drives the repetition, because if you didn't need it that way, then it would bore you. But because it's satisfying a need, you can go back to the well over and over and over. And when you look at the way that advertising works in the market, it's driven around constantly trying to escalate the value of the products they're selling to the level of a need, whether they are or not. You watch these ridiculous toothpaste commercials or, mouthwash or what have you. And man, that toothpaste gave them an orgasm. I mean, this is the best experience of their entire life. The smiles, the joy, it just lit up their whole life. No wonder I should go back and buy another tube of toothpaste tomorrow and another one the day after, because, my God, I didn't just brush my teeth. I had meaning in my life, but only for a day, so that I buy some more tomorrow. Sharon.
There was something else I read, which I want you to amplify. And it's, when a culture or an individual is in a myth, the role of thinking. And Kenneth Smith talked a little bit about that.
Yes.
If we can think our way from it, then that almost impacts our wholeness, our being. So I want you to talk about the role of thinking and myth.
Oh boy. I think we'll be talking about that for the next 2 or 3 months.
Did that make sense? Did that make sense?
I think it's the core. It's the core thread that groups all of these essays together. It's the thing he's going to come back over and over to from different angles. He part of what he's saying is that what myth did for us, presumably for many thousands of years before the recent series of epochs, is it glued us into the world. It rooted us into the world and our circumstances in such a way that our wants and desires on the one hand, and our thinking, the way we thought about the world on the other, could be aligned with the world and with sustainability and survival. That was what myth did. Myth is always presented in a modern scientific context as though it's just a stupid backwards explanation for some facts, but now we know better, so you don't need the myth. That the purpose of the myth was, where does the rain come from? Well, I guess it's the big monkey on the mountain, and he shakes his magic drum, and that makes the rain happen. And now you don't have to ask anymore. This is how myths are described from a scientific perspective. They always say it was just some factual error. They're just trying to fill in the gaps. But that's not it at all. What we needed the myths for was to shape our wanting and to shape our thinking, so that if you just turn somebody loose after they've been inculcated in myths to go want whatever they want and think whatever they think, they're not likely to think, I think a genocide would be a great idea. Or what if I uprooted every single tree on the earth and left it bald? That would be great. I mean, you're trying to frame away some of the more demonic possibilities in human behavior. And in order to do that, you can't do it by waiting until they act on it and then slapping them on the hand. You've got to shape the way that we feel and the way that we think and structure in such a way that they're aligned together and with each other, so that they nest us into the cosmos, so that we feel like we're part of it and we understand its relationship to us and vice versa, instead of imagining that we're some separated abstractivist who can act upon the world without it acting back upon us, which is the risk of the Banausic worldview. I was thinking about the way people think about nature as a source of resources or food or other kinds of things. It's like, well, food, like as though nature is in your fridge or on your shelf, or resources like it's in my toolbox, or it's in my construction room. I'll just go into nature and pick up some boards. All of the modernist metaphors for nature are not of something that encompasses and penetrates us. It's of something we have that belongs to us, that we use as we see fit. And the moment you start thinking that way, even though it's a natural proclivity of the human mind, it leads to just countless errors with terrible consequences. So myth is definitely, the purpose of it was definitely to shape our thinking, to try to get us out of that trap.
And to wed values to our thinking. And also to prompt us to question our place in the world and resist the urge to think we have it all figured out.
Yes.
Maybe that's the role of myth and thinking.
Yes.
Maybe instead of the word nature, we want to use the word ecosystem. That
too. Yeah. That's definitely a part of it. And for human beings, that's the major part of it, right? Our major experience of nature is our dependence upon the ecosystem and how much we need it more than it needs us, right? Which is funny because there are a lot of living species you can point to that the ecosystem desperately needs. Without them, like, why do we have an oxygen atmosphere? That's a bioproduct, right? I mean, living things made that atmosphere. We didn't have an oxygen atmosphere until early photosynthetics created it.
Well, think about it when you cut trees for Christmas.
Yeah, right? Exactly. We need the trees. We don't so much need us. But as human beings, we're stuck in this existential position where we do need each other. We just need each other in a way that's going to be sustainable. That we're going to
So I wonder here in this part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Because I do come from this different discipline.
Yeah.
I would question the need of myth as explanation.
Right.
And I would offer that the need of myth, the need of story, is to offer experience.
Yes.
And what makes art essential is that, quote, good art, and we could talk forever about what's good, or any art is good, but the method of creating something that is not yet real and having another human experience something in relation to that creation, which is why theater is a temporal art. It has a beginning, you experience, it's over. And theater is never the same.
Right.
Even though it's the same words from night to night. I mean, that's the challenge of video, is that there's a certain frozen statue
Yes.
that's embedded as soon as these words come out and vibrate the air around us, which may never be recreated. In fact, it will never be recreated because the audience will never be sitting in the same place at the same time with the same atmospheric pressures, with the same plagues going on outside. So the concept of, so what I'm struggling, I don't even have a terminology for this yet, but what I'm struggling with in this conversation is the concept of deliberation in the creation of myth, where I actually think that myth was created not as deliberation, but as a playing field to say, what would happen if I killed my father? What would happen if I married my mother? And embedded in that is the recipient, is the imaginer. So I don't really have I haven't firmed up this idea, but I think
I know what you're saying.
the idea of the imaginer,
Yes.
is to ask the question of the imaginer's place
Yes.
and what we choose to do with our place,
Yes.
which has very little to do with who we are and has much more to do with what we do. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, which I've been known to be wrong, the word, really, yeah, right now, for example, the word, I believe, drama, is the etymology of that word is to do. And it was the act of doing that was important, not the act of writing. And so, to me, one of those base questions is, why do we do what we do? Well, it's not just to procure existence. Although, if we don't exist, we can't do much in our current understanding of what doing is. But there are so many things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophies. We just don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
But we do know that what we don't know exists.
That's right.
Somewhere in some reality that has genuine physical effect. And so I think what I'm rolling around to here, in a not very considered way yet, is that it isn't what we do afterwards, thinking about it, that sustains a species. It's what we do at the moment. And then that reminds me of the Zen story about the monks that come to the river, and there's the beautiful woman, and she can't get across, and the first monk goes across the river, and the second monk picks her up and carries her across the river and puts her down, and then the monks are on their way. And a half an hour later, monk 1 says to monk 2, you really shouldn't have touched that woman. You really shouldn't have intervened on that. And the second monk says, well, I left the woman at the edge of the river, but apparently you're still carrying her.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't pretend to really deeply understand that, but what I think I understand about that is that our challenge comes when we get out of the present moment, and we don't actually feel what's happening. And I think that's the challenge of this age that we're in, where up is down, where what is really being expressed is an attempt to say that what you feel and what you think and how you're reacting to it does not exist. And I think it is, I'm almost done here. I think it is actually the act of thinking about it. It's never the answer.
Right.
It's always the question. So
Right.
I come back to the idea that we want to define these things. And yet when we come to a definition, we immediately know that it's not complete, that it's not good enough. And
Right.
so someone writes the next book,
Right.
or someone takes a different point of view. And then we name those people as existentialists or surrealists or Dadaists or realists, or, you know, whatever we decide to name their isms. But the reality of that is that they felt something different than what the crowd was talking about. And I actually think that that's the advantage of this current culture of instantaneous, unthought about reactionism, is that when you see it, you become a bit more discerning. You being a greater you. You know, you judge whether it has effective value, whether it affects you. So I think, again, you know, I come from this point of view of why is there an audience for theater? Why is there an audience for music? You know, if the tree
Yes.
falls in the forest, do we hear it? No, we don't hear it because our ear isn't there. If the play happens and we watch it, it happens. And it
Yes.
happens inside us, and it
Yes.
happens collaboratively.
Melinda, does the audience demonstrate that we're co-creating this reality together and just
Absolutely.
highlight the interdependence of all of us?
Mhm.
Just
It is a truism in theater that you will never see the same play twice.
Yeah,
They make it
similarly,
You
together.
cannot see the same play twice because there's too many variables.
I think it highlights the unity that Kenneth Smith is trying to evoke in this essay that he's written, that there is a unity there, and that when we try to compartmentalize or break it apart and put it into its box and put a label on that box, we're losing the big picture. And that if you take that to its extreme, you know, this is what he's pushing.
The point is that we're in the box with Schroeder's cat, Schindiger's cat, somebody's cat,
Schrodinger.
whatever his name is. His cat's in a box.
Yes.
We're in the box.
Yes.
Are we alive or dead? Yes.
And no.
And who's in the box with us to help us figure out if we're alive and dead?
Uh-huh.
Yes. No. And what period of time are we in? So then I think about anthropological studies, you know, and I think about the small amount now of indigenous people who live entire civilizations without any of this. What they live with is their stories and their songs and their dances and their tales. So I think if we ask the question, what is essential to human evolution? What is it that we want? Why can't we want what we need? I think one way to look at that is to see how people thrive as a collective.
Yes.
As a collective organism.
Yes.
So sorry if I get us off the track here because I don't know
Not at all.
philosophy, but that's why I think we're in such a dangerous moment, because aesthetics, you know, generalized term aesthetics is so diminished as a valuable and experiential moment. There's this thing that I just saw. There's people called citizen scientists, and I saw this little video on Project Juno, which is they sent the spaceship around Jupiter, but they didn't have a camera on it to begin with, and then they decided that it would be good to have a camera, and what will we do with the data? And so citizen scientists and artists took the data and made artistic creations of these photographs, which then were so informative about what this experience of space, time, beyond our potential. I mean, we can't get there.
Yeah.
We can't step into that moon of Jupiter. We can't be in that cyclone, but we can observe some of its manifestations, and how does that change us?
Yes.
As a collective experience. So that's why I think science and art are really one and the same, because it's all about questions. I keep coming back to the questions. And it's useful to have all these perspectives of philosophers. I really appreciate all these perspectives, but they are within a genre. And I think to really broaden the experience, we have to look at genres that we're not as comfortable with before we make any huge conclusions. I mean, certain things appeal to us. Certain things don't appeal to us. The cigarette analogy. You know, sorry, some people like to smoke. It's not good for you. Why do they smoke? Because there's something about it that changes their mental apparatus, that satisfies something, even if it's an addiction. You know, I mean, people take drugs, acid, to have an experience that's beyond a typical experience. So despite, you know.
And isn't it interesting that those psychedelic experiences are now becoming more and more popular, and we've just decriminalized psilocybin therapy here, that is it culture recognizing a need for this type of experience that has been lacking and embracing it now? I just hope it doesn't become over commoditized.
Right. Because if we think too much about the one silo that we're in, we begin to think that that silo is the only one, or it's the one on the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
It's Saren's eye.
This goes back to the kind of core argument of Kenneth Smith, which is that the beginning of philosophy is the recognition that we need multiple perspectives. We have to get outside of the one that we're I can't say born into, but that we wake up into when we start to think critically.
Yeah.
You know, that we take that we would tend to take for granted and consider to be all inclusive, when actually it's cutting us off from so much. We just
Which
don't
is
see it.
why, you know, I started reading as much as I could actually try to understand of Oriental cultures, of Asian cultures, of indigenous cultures, of their mythologies, of their stories of creation and being. Because it's a different way of thinking about it. To read the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita, or early Japanese mythology, like Teramatsu. Amateramatsu, the goddess of the sun, is the only goddess of a major religion that still exists, that it is still viable.
Sharon, I saw you raise your hand. Did you have a comment, Sharon?
Yes, I just had a comment, because what I'm picking up from this is that it's the function of myth. And again, Kenneth Smith, near the end of the essay, he says, but myth was the formative genius by which consciousness and intellect first erupted as active but confused principles. And I think the tension we find today is because the myth has become divorced from the reality. And that's right where we are now. And that's why we need the drugs, right? To soothe our souls from that confused principles which the myth taught us. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the essays as he expounds more on myth and our evolution as a society. Because I think now, if you take Black Lives Matter, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution and the Independence, people that look like me were not human.
Right.
And people who look like us were lesser humans.
And that myth has existed today, but the governing principles of the society have not quite accommodated to our existence. And so that's the tension that we have. And that's why I look at the function of myth with a great deal of interest and how societies manage it to take away that tension and that anxiety.
Yeah.
Really good
point. You can see this in the comments he has at the very end. Well, no, not at the very end. I'm sorry. Earlier than that, at where was we? Where he talks about never since then have we felt as at home in reality, in a reality that we could love. And let's see if we can look at. There it is. All right. So I guess it's the opening section. So I'm just going to read a little bit. To see beyond accepted convention, to see and think in an original way, is to see the world as mythic minds saw it, a world in which myths are not made, but given as the natural effluent of reality copulating with human intelligence. That's the part that you quoted before, Sharon. And from there it goes on, mind abstracted from nature, which is the modernist condition. Mind abstracted from nature is an onanistic spectator. It becomes mere intellect, mere consciousness, no longer over-rich and charged with nature's fecundity. Mind abstracted becomes a voyeur, abstractly gratified. Even when it forces nature into the Procrustean bed of controllable laboratory conditions, still it is only abstracta that will be extorted from the evidence. Quantitative data, the geometric profile of their concordance. We, and he means moderns, do not know what it is like to live in a world that can be loved and wondered at the way mythic reality can, a world in which mysticism and experience have not grown divorced, as they have for moderns. Never again since the age of myth have human beings been so utterly at home in the world. It was the honeymoon of civilization.
I think that expresses it very, very well.
It's potent, right?
Yes. That whole section really did it for me. I reread that a couple of times, those two paragraphs, because he's talking about the divorce of the society from the mythical underpinnings and what it does.
That's right. And how it corresponds to a divorce from the natural world, from the ecosystems around us. They go hand in hand with each other. As we back away from myth and back into logos thinking and logos culture, we feel more abstracted from reality. We have a more abstract idea of ourselves, not as living animals who are part of the world and need it and are penetrated by it, but instead as some kind of free thinking consciousness that just, can make decisions about the world and think about itself without reference to what's actually true and to where we are. So there's as we move into the abstractivizing mind that Hegel writes about, we sort of make ourselves homeless. We uproot ourselves and we feel more and more naked and alone at the same time that we're not at the same time that we get this power to conceive of the world on infinite scales abstractly, we lose the power to place ourselves concretely within it. Hegel writes about this a lot, and this is one of his core arguments about the dangers of the abstractivizing mind. So what the myths were doing that we lose as we back away from them is they were giving us a sense of meaning and value and place and context so that things made sense. And what's ironic about that is that when we imagine somebody trying to perform those functions, we think they would be giving us answers. But what Kenneth Smith argues is that the fundamental criteria for something to be a myth is instead, like was being discussed, like Melinda was saying earlier, is that it asks questions. It teaches us to ask questions. So at the same time that myths made us feel at home, they encouraged us to treat our opinions skeptically and to look for a larger world that we're at home in. It's ironic that we lose both of those things at the same time as we back away into an abstract, systematized way of life.
Sharon,
on the idea of like the importance of multiple perspectives. I do have actually a really good quote, but I think maybe I'll share it at a future time. People kind of dropping off, but there was kind of an interesting article. I'll share a different one, like a different article I read some years ago from like a feminist woman of color, and kind of like the problem kind of within our culture, the way we've been raised, like, is that only white people's feelings matter, right? And so it was it's a little provocative, like how she ended her piece, but I think it's kind of useful as a tool of defamiliarization. This is like a formal term, like just to kind of put yourself in this unusual situation to get a new perspective. And so the way she put it is, that, like say speaking as a white, like I'm not white, but like just, like that's sort of, the white is sort of the normal, like in our culture, that's the normal human experience has been equated to, the universal human experience. Okay, but as a white person, it's like, not the realization that, oh, you as a person of color are like me, but importantly phrasing it, I am like you. So that was interesting how she I mean, I'm not sure that all people will be receptive to that, but I think it was kind of a good way of like, reversing the frame, right? And kind of, just by explicitly doing that, this is kind of a Foucaultian idea of like kind of revealing kind of the structure, of power, right? And, like and like kind of what is defined as like kind of the default human experience, right? Like,
right.
But it is. I've just finished reading Begin Again by Eddie Cloud, in which he looked at the life that Baldwin. And Baldwin, in the second chapter, Baldwin says that the fundamental problem in the society is the lie, which is the myth. And I go back to this. I think the myth sets us up for tension or anxiety when it doesn't correlate with reality.
Yeah, this is the radical thing that Kenneth Smith and Nietzsche and others are arguing here, is that when it doesn't correlate us, when it doesn't drive us into reality and out of our minds, it isn't a myth anymore. It's now become a pseudo myth or an anti-myth.
Yes.
It's become unhealthy. Instead of opening our minds and rooting us in the world, it's closing our minds and divorcing us from the world.
Good.
And yet, in the modern world, we call that a myth too. And this is where we get into our language problems. It's an interesting feature of the modern era that many of the most important ideas from a Greek naturalist perspective for what it takes to be a sustainable society or a sustainable human being, how to feel well and how to think well, those terms don't exist in English. They've all been turned into something else. It's not a coincidence. It's not an accident. We aren't randomly missing a few words here and there. It's like there's been a wholesale purging, not because somebody designed it that way, not because of a conspiracy, but because of convergence. This is the nature of the culture that we're in. The ideas that make you fit better into this culture, however healthy or unhealthy it may be, those ideas survive and spread. And the ideas that are in radical conflict with our culture, that would make us question it, that would make us bite the hand that feeds us and rock the boat, those ideas, they don't get rewarded. They're not placita, they don't please people. And so they ebb away out of the language. They get used less until eventually we think that a myth is just a lie, right? Because the idea that there's something here that we desperately need and that we don't have it, and that our culture has no intention of giving it to us because it's profiting off of our absence of it, that idea is not thinkable or expressible or not rewarded, shall we say, in the marketplace. So,
Okay. It's Thursday the 3rd.
So yeah, it's he's building off of, there's some discussion in Nietzsche of what he calls amythia. And Nietzsche coins this term as being like a medical condition, but he calls it a psychological cultural condition that is as serious as any medical condition. So that for human beings to live without being deeply immersed in genuine myths is a sick condition for us. It leads to bad behavior and bad consequences for us. That as animals, we need myth. We're storytelling animals. We you know, the dance, the music, the stories, the drama, the things that we do that bind us together into the world and as a culture, we have to have those psychologically. And if we don't have them, we get sick. And the sickness can show up as a vitiation so that we're not able to be effective in the world, but it can also show up as the other kind of vitiation where we become incredibly effective at vice. So we can have a world war, or we can have a giant Holocaust, because we're sort of so committed to the wrong things. We're going in such an unhealthy direction. So, but I mean, the idea that we need mythology right off the bat is very anti-modern, right?
Yes.
It's like the sentence sounds like it's self-contradiction, which, you know, from our perspective means it's a stretch for us to get to be able to think these thoughts. But from the perspective of a culture critic like Nietzsche or Smith, it is a condemnation of modernism as a way of life. So it's any way of life that drives you away from the things that you need in order to be healthy and sane is a sick way of life. And so he calls it an anti-culture. You know, he calls what we perpetrate as our entertainment anti-myths. And our portrayal of time as being regimented, and you have to work this many hours whether you're productive or not, whether you need more time because you're sick or not, that you always, you know, have to fill the quanta and not the quality of the time. He calls that anti-time. And he says the way that we think about the world and ourselves, we call it thinking, but it's actually anti-thought, because genuine thinking would be helping us. If we were actually thinking thoughts the way an animal thinks thoughts, you know, when the cat thinks thoughts, it leads it to a nap or a sunbeam or some water or to the prey or whatever it is that it needs. But when we think thoughts, we're encouraged to consume instead, and to vote, and to do these sort of abstracted things that keep us from engaging at the level we need to engage. And therefore, we can call them all thoughts. But if you do a value judgment in terms of, you know, what is its worth to us, they're anti-thoughts. We're sort of being sculpted into having anti-minds that work against us, that make us service the economy rather than each other and the ecology. And all of these are very anti-modern things to do, to talk about it this way. The idea that we should be able to categorize thoughts that way, categorize stories that way, and that not only should we be able to, but that we need to, and that it's dangerous for us if we don't do it because of the liability of, you know, thinking, what if I just exterminated everybody who looks a certain way? You know, it's like, you know, the idea that thought and the thought that we should be kind to each other are the same kind of thought we take for granted from a modernist perspective. A thought is a thought. But from a value judgment perspective, there's really something important in saying, you know, if I think, well, what if I got rid of all the Jews? That's not actually a thought. That's an anti-thought.
Yes.
Right? No sane, healthy thing would think that thought. It's not, it's to pretend that they're all the same is to pretend that there's no difference between the things that make us healthier and the things that make us sicker, between the things that make the world better and the things that make the world worse. And that's why he says repeatedly that the value-free information is worthless. Value-free knowledge is worthless. It's and worse than that, it's dangerous. It's, you know, it's a poison. And the fact that our minds are structured in such a way that if we get in the wrong culture, we can't discriminate between one and the other, and we think that they're the same kind of thing, it is like the way that somebody can feed us poison with a lot of sugar and we think it's candy. We think this is food, well, even when it's not. So this is why he said, go ahead, Sharon.
I like the way he ends, because
Please.
The question in my mind is what is myth? What was myth? Is where he says to ask what was myth is to ask what was soul, what was spirit, what was culture, what was life. I think that's all encompassing and pretty profound. And I don't know how we express it in the philosophical background, but the essay ends like this. And even though he is cited many references, he still has this question unanswered near the end.
Yes. This is where the power of the polyperspectival approach to philosophy pays off. As we say, instead of providing answers, we're going to ask questions.
Yes.
And the questions we're going to ask are to try to say, can we learn how to get our mind momentarily out of the modernist perspective it's trapped in and put it inside of an ancient perspective to be able to see what myth might have been for them that maybe could inform what life could be for us today if we knew that it could be seen that way from such a different perspective. I offer a little bit of etymological poetry he's got hidden in here. He uses the word archaic. I'm going to put the word archaic in the chat. Right? Archaic means old, right? Out of date. It means, prehistoric, obsolete, primitive, bad, not as good as we are. Although those are all archaic things. Clumsy, crude, undeveloped, not as technological, not as sophisticated, not as scientific, not as objective. Right? These are all, this whole arena surrounds the word archaic. If we talk about the archaic Greeks, that's even older than the classical Greeks or the ancient Greeks. Archaic means, wow, they must have been really clumsy back then. But the word archaic doesn't come from words for stupid or crude or primitive. It comes from the word archai, which is a Greek term. The archai are the potent formative principles of the cosmos that make everything go. Right? Where a principle isn't a fixed idea or a delusion or an ideology, but a principle is like a seed of thought, and that unfolds and unfolds and unfolds to implications that organize the way we see the world. Or if it's not a human principle or a thought principle, but a cosmic principle, we're talking about the reason why life works the way it does, the reason why gravity works the way it does, the reason why everything unfolds the way it does. Those reasons are the archai that drive everything, that shape everything by the way that they unfold and interact with each other. There's nothing more important than the archai, right? If we are suffering beings who live in the world and are penetrated by nature, the archai are what penetrate us. This is what the polytheistic Greek religion was attempting to catalog, is what are the things and what are the archai that rule over us that we have to learn about so we can navigate our way through the world without screwing up so much. So to be archaic is to be closer to the archai, not to be primitive or crude or stupid, but to be much closer to the core principles that make things go. And if we talk about myth from that perspective and culture from that perspective, part of what we're saying is, that through their myths, they were able to organize their culture and their way of life and their thinking in a way that aligned them more closely with the way the world actually works, with the deep principles of the world. That we as moderns are more abstracted away from the archai. And as a result, we often forget what they are. What are the things that truly matter? What actually makes us go? We can live our whole lives without ever seriously asking questions about these things, and let alone coming up with decent answers for them, if you know what I mean.
Well,
So,
Professor Marshall, I must say,
hi,
it
Ginny.
is so wonderful listening to you. And hello, Sharon. This is Ginny. Hi.
Hi, Ginny.
But Professor Marshall, as always, it's just so amazing to listen to you speak. All the knowledge that you have inside.
He's got a great brain to pick, doesn't he?
Oh, God, you're making me blush.
And he is so articulate, and he just succinct in the way he just lays it all out so quickly and so easily, and so just slides out of his anyway. I need to go, but I thank you so much for,
Well, what you just said summarizes this this second chapter here, when it's Mythos, soul, and earth.
Yeah.
And it takes us into the next one. And I see this discussion on a continuum, and it's all about the functionality of myth and our adaptation.
Yes.
And seen through the eyes of different times of the philosophers. And I know nothing about philosophy, so I find this absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it so? Isn't it so?
Yes.
Okay, well, very good. I'll see you later. Next
See you
time.
next week,
All
Jenny.
right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Jenny.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sharon, you're right. It's right there in the title. I mean, the reason that the title is Myth, Soul, Earth is because a real myth is what binds the soul to the earth. It's what makes
That's
us actually
right.
rooted in the world
Yes.
and aligned with
Yes.
it. And if it doesn't do that, it's not really a myth.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Well, with that, I gotta run.
Okay.
I'm gonna sign off too.
Thank
See
you,
you later,
everyone.
It's 4:30 in South Florida.
Yeah, let's wrap up here, but it's been great.
We'll see you
It's
all
been
next
great,
week.
and thank you very much. See you all next week.
See you next
Thank
week.
you, David.
Thank you.
Bye.
Sharon.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. I can't find my sign off button. Okay, there it is.
See you next week, Hannah. So
Yeah.
that was okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So tonight I'll reread Myth, Art, and Dreams and put the little outline in, and then write up the